Today I'm going to read The Red Turret by Flavia Richardson. Flavia Richardson is well known as a writer of creepy stories and of much other magazine fiction. Her novels are written under another name, for she prefers not to mix her styles of work. In private life, she's the wife of Oscar Cook, another gifted writer of thrillers. I'm going to be including some of Oscar Cook's short stories on this channel, so click the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and then you'll know as soon as another story gets added. After a lapse of nearly half a century, an Erringham came once more to the home of his fathers. Roy Erringham had spent the first 30 years of his life abroad. Born and bred in Canada, he never saw his old home until he walked into it by right of succession one October evening. Jerome Erringham, his father, was dead. Going abroad a poverty-stricken younger son, he had carved his way to fame and wealth, if not fortune, by his own efforts and those of his wife. Roy, the only child, had inherited the bulk of his wealth. 10 years before, his father had come into the Erringham property, but business necessities had kept him from coming to take possession. Moreover, he counted himself an outcast and a working man, one who had but little desire to live in the lordly home of his fathers. Now there was only one Erringham left in the world, the last of a once proud and spreading family, and that one was Roy. True, there was hope for the future, for Helen, Roy's wife of a year, was a healthy woman, and there was no reason why she shouldn't bear sons. Together, Roy and Helen walked into the old house on the day after they landed in England. Roy loved it. Helen hated it and feared it. "But it's beautiful," he said as he led her from one room to another. "Beautiful, can't you see it?" She shook her head. "I can't bear it, Roy. I don't think I can live here. It's too gloomy. There's something uncanny about it. The house seems to be watching us. Don't you feel it?" He shook his head and patted her on the shoulder. "Of course it's watching us, silly. Why not? It's the old home of the Erringhams. We've been here for centuries. It's glad we've come back. It wants to make sure we're the right sort." "The right sort?" Helen repeated with a shiver. "Yes, Roy, but what does this house want?" Her voice shrilled a little. "You're tired," he spoke with masterful decision. "Come and rest for a bit. We'll go over the rest of the house tomorrow." Away in the newer wing, which the housekeeper engaged by the lawyers had rendered habitable, Helen felt less disturbed. She determined that, come what might, she would have her own rooms in this new and more comfortable quarter. Not for her the stone-walled grandeur of the great dining room or the panels of the long saloon. She admitted, though, that she could appreciate grandeur in the abstract. She wanted modernity and comfort in real life. Tucked up on a luxurious Chesterfield, a shaded electric standard at her elbow, a new magazine on the occasional table, she felt at peace. This was home. She began to get a touch of warmth into her feeling for the old house. After all, it was only natural that so old a place should have an atmosphere. "Perhaps it's me," she murmured, half asleep. "I'm the thing that's wrong. I don't belong here. I belong to Canada. I'm not really an Erringham. It thinks I'm an interloper." In the morning, various business claimed both her and Roy. In the afternoon, neighbours, forgetful of the bother of settling into a new house that had been shut up for years, insisted on coming to call. Not till dinner was over did Roy have time to finish his tour. "You'll come with me, darling," he said, a little anxiously. Helen assented. After all, it was her home. She must make it like her. She must herself grow accustomed to the atmosphere. They went through the long succession of rooms that they had seen the day before, till at last they reached the picture gallery. It ran the whole width of the house on the first floor. Above it was nothing but the roof. The high ceiling had been built to give an impression of space. The bedrooms on the floor above were all in the other wing. Helen went to one of the long mullioned windows and looked out. "We look down on the terrace here," she observed over her shoulder. Then she added, "Roy, the door to the turret ought to be somewhere here. It's at this end of the house." "Of course." He joined her at the window and took his bearings. "That's funny," he said, looking back into the room. "There's no sign of a door here. Wonder where it is." He strolled over to the end of the room, and Helen followed him, scanning the Erringham ancestors idly as she passed. Suddenly she gave a little cry and covered her face with her hands. "What's the matter?" Roy was beside her in an instant. "That picture!" she cried, pointing to the corner in the deepest shadow. "It moved! I'm sure it did!" Her voice rose a little trifle. "Steady on, darling," Roy spoke reprovingly. "You never used to have nerves like these. Of course it didn't move. Let's go over and look at it. Can't see who it is from here. It's too dark." He stepped to the wall to turn on the electric light, but the switch was dead. With an exclamation of annoyance, he turned back. "I've got my torch with me," he said. "Come on, Helen. We'll kill this bogey of yours before we go downstairs." He pressed the button of the torch and directed the glare onto the picture in the corner. "Great-grandfather," he said, his eye catching the date on the frame. "He's not a very pleasant-looking old bird, is he?" Helen laughed nervously. She saw the distinctive Erringham features, saw too how they were reproduced in Roy. Standing there with a faint radiance on his face, he might almost have been his great-grandfather come back to life. "I believe there was some sort of scandal about the old man," said Roy, as he looked at the portrait again. "I don't know what it was. Dad never mentioned it. But when I went through his papers after he was dead, I found some funny passages in some old letters that his mother sent him. She was daughter-in-law to this old man and lived here with my grandfather before he came into the property. I gather he was a bit of a queer fish, but I don't know why." "I don't like him," Helen whispered. "He looks so evil." "Not too prepossessing," agreed Roy. "Got the worst type of Erringham face, hasn't he?" He lifted the torch and looked at the picture from another angle. "Hello," he said. "What's that? Do you see a handle or something on the side of the frame? I believe it's the entrance to the door of the turret. Let's go and see." "Oh, don't, Roy," Helen pleaded, urged by some instinct for which she could not account. "Please don't, just wait for daylight." "Not I," he returned. "The moon's coming up. The view from the turret over to the hills will be perfectly marvellous. Come along, Helen. Don't be a scaredy cat," he taunted. She set her lips and waited while he pulled at the handle. As they had expected, the whole portrait swung round and a narrow flight of steps was disclosed to view. "I wonder why they hid it," said Roy as he swung the light up. "Not much hidden, was it? We should have seen the lever at once in the daylight." Helen was determined to make the whole matter as uninteresting and commonplace as she could. Somehow she sensed that in the turret lay danger. Danger not so much to herself as to Roy, and she was determined to give it no aid by preparing to be afraid. "Perhaps," Roy assented a little unwillingly. He gave one glance at the portrait of his great-grandfather and then began to climb up the staircase. It wound round in a narrow spiral, evidently built in the thickness of the outer wall, while the turret itself rested on the roof of the picture gallery. Helen followed, partly because she did not dare to trust Roy alone with what might happen, and partly because she herself did not dare to stop alone in the picture gallery with the Erringhams around. To her sensitive mind, an air of repellent contempt came from the pictured faces. She knew they were not so much resentful of her as pitying, but pitying with a sneer. Setting her teeth, she tossed her head at the lot of them and put her foot on the first stair. The staircase was only the height of the gallery, and 3 or 4 turns took them to the door at the top, which barred the way. Roy turned the great iron handle and pushed the door ajar. It was a heavy oaken affair, clamped with metal bands and screws. No one could have passed it without immense effort had it been barred. "Here's the turret," said Roy, throwing the beam forward. Helen pressed to his side, and together they looked in amazement. The turret was much larger than it looked from the ground, whence it gave the impression of being merely a pepper box. It was deceptively built, its size running inwards along the width of the roof, so that the chimney stacks broke the line and hid much of it. On 3 sides were windows, deep set, filled with thick glass, on which strange designs had been painted, evidently by amateur hands. Helen walked over to them and looked at them closely. The moon was shining full into the little room, and its strange furnishings were clearly picked out. Roy snapped off the torch, for it wasn't needed, and he knew that the battery was wearing low. He would want what light he had to help them down the spiral stairs and through the picture gallery. The moon passed behind a cloud, and for a moment the room was plunged into darkness. Before Helen could implore Roy to put on the torch, there came a strange, unearthly radiance, filling the whole place and yet appearing from a source unknown. Helen shrank back into the embrasure of the window, frightened. Roy stood still in the middle of the room, taken unawares, yet amazed rather than scared. He knew all at once that he had dimly expected this, that as an Erringham he must be present at some strange, mysterious rite, and make a choice. He waited. Helen waited also. She grew less afraid. Her eyes roamed round the room. In the dim yet clear red of the light, it was easy to pick out the objects on the floor. In the wall that had no window was set a table. On it stood a golden plate and cup. Before it was a narrow mat, ivory white, worked in black. The light was so clear that she could distinguish the pattern of fir cones that formed the chief feature of the scrolled design. In the distance, a clock struck 10 times. The normal sound would ordinarily have reassured her, suggesting, as it did, a house inhabited by servants, a sane and pleasant life to which she could return at any moment if she so chose. But at the moment of the first stroke of the clock, some new power seemed to fill the room. It was so subtle, so strong, and so unexpected that for the moment Helen was nearly overwhelmed by it. It gave her no time to prepare. It caught her, as it were, in a web of fine tissue and held her, unable to speak or move, yet conscious of all that went on. She tried to cry out to Roy, but her voice was strangled in her throat. She tried to go to him, but her limbs seemed paralyzed. Her eyes fixed themselves on him and saw the change that came over his features. He had lost some of the wonder that marked them when the phenomenal light began to appear. He was looking absorbed, interested almost. Helen shuddered mentally as if he were about to enjoy himself. He seemed to be expecting something, as if he knew what was about to happen and why. Out of the radiance of the red light, a figure seemed to materialize, the figure of an old man wearing the robes of a priest. He turned, and Helen caught sight of his mocking, sardonic face. Her head reeled. She found she could not faint. Roy's great-grandfather stood in the middle of the room, beckoning to Roy, and Roy went to him gladly, as if it were a natural thing.
"Erringham of the Erringhams, you have come."
The words could have issued from no living mouth, yet Helen would have sworn that she heard them clearly spoken. Roy took another step toward that strange figure clad in gold and black, with touches of white that gleamed red in the light. "I have come," he said with assurance, as one who saw no cause for fear. "What do you want?"
"Tonight you have your choice,"
the strange, unearthly voice went on.
"Your father refused to choose. He died a stranger in a strange land rather than face the choice of the Erringhams. Your grandfather died. Your uncle died. You have come back."
"I am here," Roy reiterated. "What do I choose?"
whether you will eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, whether you will learn the control of the life force, whether you will be as God, even as I am, and conquer even the last great enemy, death, that rides upon the pale horse and passes no one by.
And the price?
There is none. Knowledge is power. What more do you desire? Death shall pass you by, so shall you escape the final reckoning, since only the dead can be judged by God.
I choose. I will follow you. The old man's eyes seemed to gleam more brightly, and the face he turned towards Helen was distorted with devilish glee. She tried again to scream, to warn Roy, but she couldn't make a sound. And the ritual? Roy asked. He had not moved, but it was plain that he was beginning to suffer from suppressed excitement. His face was very pale, and the sweat began to show on his forehead.
The service of sacrifice shall be held tonight.
The strange apparition went to the table built against the wall, which Helen, her heart sinking again, now recognized as an altar. He busied himself for a moment with the golden vessels. Then he bent down and touched a spring in front of the table. It swung open, and controlled by the same spring, a stone slab slid quietly forward, resting some 6 inches above the ground. On it lay a strangely shaped knife, the handle glittering with jewels.
All is prepared,
said the man as he drew himself up again. In obedience to a sign, Roy came forward to the altar and flung himself on his knees. Old Erringham stood before the stone slab and raised his arms. He began to chant, softly at first, then more loudly in that terrible room. At first, Helen could not pick out the words, was only aware that they were in a strange tongue. Then gradually, something familiar yet mysterious about them struck her, and she realized, with a further pang of horror, that she was listening to that foulest of rites, the Black Mass. But there should be a sacrifice. There must be blood, she heard herself saying, able to speak for the first time, but seemingly unable to control her words.
There shall be blood. There shall be blood and a burnt offering. There shall be a willing sacrifice.
Came back to her, chanted by the priest. Moving in spite of herself, with no power over her limbs, walking as if hypnotized, Helen found herself crossing the floor to that terrible altar. Roy still knelt, his face buried in his hands. She tried to speak to him, but could not. She could not even touch him as she went by. She must move as if in a dream. Still, without conscious volition, yet terribly aware of all that was going on, Helen found herself lying on the slab, staring up into the face of the Erringham apostate. She was nearly rendered unconscious by the malevolence of his look. Suddenly, an inner power came to her. She knew that she could only save herself by a supreme effort, still more, that only so could she save Roy. Summoning every ounce of willpower, she broke the bonds that controlled her. She found her voice. Brokenly, only half conscious of what she said, she began to recite the Pater Noster. At the first words, her fury seized the demon bending above her. He seized the jewelled-handled knife and thrust it into Roy's hands.
It is the moment of sacrifice,
he chanted, his voice drowning Helen's feeble tones.
It is the moment for the spilling of the blood. See, my son, I place the golden cup beneath the stone, that it may catch the precious drops as they run, that you and I may drink from them and live.
As one in a dream, Roy rose from his knees and took the knife that was held out to him. He tested the blade against his nail, swung it in the air, and "Roy!" Helen screamed. The sound startled him. He dropped the knife. It fell across his leg, gashing the shin through his sock. A little blood trickled out and across the altar stone. With a cry of baffled fury mingled with desire, old Erringham bent down and tried to catch the flow in the golden chalice. Helen, on her feet by now, caught the cup, making the sacred sign as she did so. There was a blinding flash of light that seemed to come from the altar. The room was lighted up, and at the same moment a crashing peal of thunder broke over the house. As it died away, came another ominous crash, and the roof of the turret started to crumble and fall in. Helen seized Roy and dragged him to the head of the stairs. Behind them was a rumbling of falling stones and plaster, with a crash at intervals as one of the big roof beams came down. Somehow they staggered down the stairs and through the picture gallery till they roused the frightened servants to action. The storm had been sharp and sudden. Only that one flash and one crack of thunder had been heard. In the morning they went upstairs to see the damage done. The picture gallery seemed unharmed in spite of the masonry that had fallen on its roof. But when they went to the door of the staircase, Roy and Helen started back in amazement. The picture of old Erringham, the wizard, the devotee, the black one, had been torn from its frame and lay, a great cut in the canvas over the heart, face downwards on the floor. They dragged it to one side and forced their way up to the turret. One wall still stood, the one against which had been built the altar stone. For the rest, Roy and Helen stood under the sweet blue sky and the clean sunlight. Beneath the altar was a heap of rubbish. Roy went over to examine it. He came back, his face graver than before.
"Don't go to look," he said. I must get someone to help. They are bones. There must have been a body buried there."
Helen turned white. "Your great-grandfather," she said.
"I expect so. You remember they always said his grave was empty in the churchyard. Last night the devil came for his own."
Helen shivered. "I'm glad the turret has gone," she said, and led Roy to the head of the stairs.